I hope I don't turn out shiny in this like I did on the first take. Exposure can sometimes be really intimidating. And while there is gear out there that can help you get correct exposure, it's usually pretty expensive. Well, there's no need to be intimidated or spend all kinds of money on fancy gear, because in this video, I'm going to show you how to nail your exposure. Let's get into it. Some cameras have really cool tools built into them to help with exposure, like zebras or something like that. I'm on the Canon M50 and it doesn't have that. All I have is the histogram. So the first thing you want to do is turn on your camera's histogram. Now most cameras do have one of these, it's even on my Canon M50. And a quick Google search will show you how to bring it up on your camera. Now at first glance it may look a little complicated, but don't worry. Once you know what's going on, it's actually really simple. Here are the basics. On the left side of the histogram is complete black, and on the right side is complete white. If all of the white stuff on your histogram is to the left, that means your shot is underexposed, and if it's all the way to the right, that means it's overexposed. Now what you want to do is try to get your exposure somewhere in the middle. And keep in mind there is variance depending on the type of shot you want. So if you want something that's a little bit darker, it's okay if it's a little bit to the left, and if you want a bright shot, it's okay if it's a little bit to the right. You just want to make sure not all of the values are on one side or the other. Generally, you want to keep your shot away from the edges and have it be smooth without any, drastic spikes or anything. If you accidentally expose too dark, your footage will get very grainy whenever you try to bring it back up in post. And if you expose too bright, it's just impossible to get any of the detail back. Now with that said, it's okay if it touches the far left side with the shadows or the far right side with highlights. You just need to kind of check the ratio and make sure that what you want underexposed is about right or overexposed is about right. You don't want it to be too much overexposure or too much underexposure. All that information is great, but how do you actually adjust your exposure? This is where the exposure triangle comes into play, and it's called that because there are three main things that you can use to adjust exposure. The first thing is shutter speed, which is how much time your sensor is exposed to light. The second thing is aperture, which is how much light your sensor is exposed to at any given moment in time. And the third thing is ISO, which is basically your sensor's sensitivity to that light. Now if you're shooting pictures, all three of these things are free to be tinkered with. However, if you're shooting video and you're using the traditional shutter speed being twice that of your frame rate, that one's stuck. That means to get correct exposure, you need to do something with either aperture or ISO. Keep in mind that aperture controls the depth of field on an image. I quite like the blurry background kind of look, so I tend to keep it as wide open as possible. But I also keep it wide open to make sure my ISO is as low as possible. See, as you crank the ISO up to brighten an image, it tends to make the image grainy. The higher the ISO, the noisier the image gets. That's why if I'm underexposed, I open up the aperture, which means get the f-stop to a lowest number before I touch the ISO. And then if I'm overexposed, I decrease the ISO before I touch the aperture. Basically, I try to keep the ISO as low as possible and just change the aperture to get the image I'm looking for. And it's only when the exposure is too dark, even with the aperture wide open, that I'll start increasing the ISO to get the image back to the center of the histogram. If you're confused by all of this information, don't worry, I know it's a lot to take in. The biggest recommendation I have is to take a look at the histogram on your camera and play around with shutter speed, aperture, and ISO and see how that kind of affects the image and the histogram at the same time. Play around with it, get to know how they're related, and if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments down below this video. I'll be more than happy to answer them as soon as possible. If you have any other subjects you want me to cover, let me know that as well. I really hope this video was helpful to you, and I'll see you in the next one.